Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Talking Insights. Welcome to the first episode of the year. We took some time off for the holidays, and now we're back. And today we're going to explore how organizations can identify the next big thing before it hits the mainstream. For this, we're going to be joined by the authors of a recent Research World article, The Next Big Thing, Exploring the Edge for High Growth Opportunities. Today we'll have Sandro Kaulartz, Ajay Bangia, April Jeffries, and Karin O'Neill. And their work brings a fresh perspective to innovation by focusing on people and behaviors at the margins, what they call the edge. And by combining AI-powered discovery with deep human empathy to spot high potential opportunities earlier and with more confidence. In this conversation, we'll unpack the EDGE framework, extreme behaviors, divergences from norms, gaps in workarounds, and eccentric quirks, and discuss how organizations can apply it to strategy, growth, and forensic work. Stick around, it's a great conversation. So, hi everyone. Hi April, Sandro, Karin, AJ. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks so much for your time to be on Talking Insights. When we talked about, and when I talked with AJ about the project that he was developing like a few weeks ago, he was telling me about like this EDGE framework and this EDGE project that you were all working on. And it seemed very interesting the way that he inspired me to look more about it. And I asked him to write a research role article on it with all your help. But I want to know more. I want to know what the whole concept, what the whole project is all about, and what the EDGE framework is. So can any of you tell me what it's all about?
So I can start. So Ajay and I were talking about where do some of these big opportunities come from? And a lot of times it seems to happen over time, right? But we realized it was coming from these weird little places. And, what does that mean? And so we developed this whole concept around the edge, which is extreme behaviors, divergences from the norm, gaps and hacks is something that we say. So, what are people doing to kind of solve their own problems? And what are some of the eccentricities that they have? So, we thought that was kind of a neat little way to put it. And what we also realized is that today with AI, a lot of times it kind of takes you to what's commonly done. And the real way to get to things that are different and that are unique and that are emerging would be to look at these edges and what people are doing outside of the norm.
That's great. We have a lot of people in this podcast. It's four of you. I imagine that four of you worked on the project. But this question is kind of like a more direct for every one of you. Which part of the whole framework do you find individually the most powerful in your work?
It's a combination of everything. So, like you mentioned, there are four of us who authored the paper, and each one of us brings a interesting perspective. We started off with trying to solve a conundrum to figure out where does growth sit. And April, being the global president for our ethnography and immersions practice, was able to take a look at a deep understanding of individuals and try to decode the whys behind the behavior. Now, typically, like April said, there's a bit of a concern that the industry tends to have when it comes to AI, that typically it gives you middle of the run sort of information. It tends to average out what's happening. Sandro, with his expertise, was able to turn that around and use AI to look for instances in social data, which were in the context of what's new, what's different, what is the odd behavior that we can pick up on. And he's drawn extensively on his work with MIT and our academic partners there. Karin brings in a very deep understanding of what do you do with after you find this with her expertise at the client side of the business. And I was able to sort of help with sort of trying to look at how we can use AI to ideate solutions in terms of what could then be applied to the mass in the middle. So from the learnings of the edge, how do we translate that into something that could be applicable to the mass in the middle itself to unlock those opportunities for growth.
Yeah, and maybe just to build on that a little bit, maybe we could tell a little bit about how we each sort of came at this. And as Ajay mentioned, I came from the client side, and I had a couple of experiences that were similar to what we're doing here, but not quite as refined of a method. And so, a couple of examples I'll give you. So, I worked in innovation for quite a long time, and one of the categories I worked in was hair care. And something that we discovered using social listening, social intelligence, which is kind of a predecessor to what Sandro is going to talk about, was that people were washing their hair with conditioner instead of shampoo. And that's something that today, if you worked in hair care, you'd say, oh, that's probably old news. But I can tell you at the time, it was very new news. And so we were very excited to find this out and then figure out why they were doing it and then what it meant for our category. So again, sort of a similar kind of process, but not as refined as what we're doing here. And then at the same time, on other categories I worked on and other projects, we also worked with sort of extreme inspirational design targets, which were, as April said, talking about the extremes. So I've sort of seen the power of using a process like this. So as folks here started building it, I got really excited that we could sort of make a systemic way of doing this kind of work.
Sandro, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, the most interesting piece is because both groups, like the qualitative practice and Synthesio, which is Ipsos big data analytics practice, were actually doing quite similar things, but we actually only realized that at a late moment. So in our part, we are working with the MIT Innovation Lab. So it's a group of academics and practitioners who really fell in love with the idea of open innovation and user-led innovation under the principle that all good innovation come from those at the fringes of a category, those who experience needs before the mass market would experience, those who adopt trends earlier. And there is a very important academic, his name is Eric van Hippel, who's facilitated this innovation lab. And he coined the term in the mid-'80s, lead users, and he developed methods. So I had the great privilege to work with him to apply the things we were doing with machine learning, semantic and generative AI to bring this discipline into a new world, which is essentially the same, right? So you scan the entire web and then you may find some weird things happening on a subreddit. Right? Think biohacking, think really on the most common things such as cleaning. You would find a group of people who would do ASMR cleaning, like this very slow moving, conscious way of cleaning your house. And those are incredible, strong inspirations for companies who want to seek novelty and are maybe a little tired from looking at the mass market and the average and what everybody's doing. And funny enough, when you study the discipline a little longer, you will see that many things that are so essential in our day-to-day life started actually from users. The first disposable diaper was not invented by a corporation, but 40 years earlier, before they were manufactured, there was a lady in Canada who had triplets who did the first version of that. Or think Netflix, or think Dyson. There's so many things in our day-to-day lives that started from users. So I was just fascinated with the discipline because I'm working in research for quite a long time, and it never occurred to me that there is innovation that is outside of corporate innovation. And when meeting with April, Ajay, and Karin, I realized we are actually looking at the same thing. So we blended those two disciplines together quite nicely so we can use the power of big data to discover essentially all of it, all the weirdness that happens, but then use our qualitative expertise to really decode the why behind. What is the motivation? What is the lifestyle? Why are people really motivated to start hacking and innovating in those domains? So it was really filling super nice gaps that we had in our methodologies individually. That's what we think is really powerful because it creates a giant impact for our clients.
Yeah. I don't know, April, do you have anything that you want to add? How do you, or which part of the framework do you find more powerful in your work?
So I work more with the immersive work. So for me, it was more about taking some of the things you see in context with people, right? Like as you observe some of the things that they're doing. When we saw what Sandro was doing, to be honest with you, it started out a little bit like Ajay, we're like, they stole our idea. Listen to what they're saying. They're talking about lead users. And then the more we spoke to Sandro, it was like, oh my gosh, this is very complimentary. So, he could help us identify some of these things. And then I was really passionate about, okay, now that we see it, let's talk to these people. Let's see how they're living. Let's see some of the things they're really doing within this context and idea. And because they're so extreme, a lot of times when you talk to them, they are the most fascinating discussions you could ever think about, right? They're a little weird, which for a qualitative person is like nirvana, right? Let me talk to the weird people and see what it is they're doing. So for me, it was that, like how these two things came together and how that depth of really understanding beyond the obvious could really help enhance this whole process.
It's very interesting. You're saying that Sandro was doing something, and then you look at it and it's like, oh, it's kind of stealing our job, and it's stealing what we're doing, and then it led to like a collaboration. I feel like sometimes people nowadays, when it comes to AI, they have like a bit of that mindset, like, oh no, it's gonna like transform everything, it's gonna like steal our jobs, and then they understand there can be some kind of collaboration. They understand the tools, they understand how to use it, and the skills that can be developed on it. And that leads me to the whole AI and human-centered research you're all talking about. How does it work together in practice? The AI, the agentic AI, the qualitative human-centered research, because they're two kind of different, but again, they can collaborate and they can work together. How does it work together in practice, and how do they contribute? From one can contribute to the other.
Yeah, maybe I can start on that. So on our side, what we do is obviously discovering those hacks, those user-led innovations. And people don't like, hey, here's something. Do you like it? Right? They give you a lot of layers where they're coming from, why they did it. And it gives you a first sense of what is the deeper rooted aspiration, the need, the motivation, and so on. But what we sometimes tend to forget is when we look at digital data, think Instagram, think TikTok, is really how people project themselves, how they want to be seen by a community, which is nice and interesting, but also limiting, right? Because what we really need to understand, did this biohacker now write like, 3,000-word post about a new way to, sustain energy during the day because he really wanted to share that? Or was it more to project themselves being part of the group, right? So is the social dimension actually more important than factual and functional element that he's posting out there? And only qualitative research really helps us to get there. So I think we do a pretty good job in discovering and giving some layers and arguments. But then the qualitative work, which is really about spending time, getting in touch with people and understanding deeply from the unspoken, is really filling a very important gap. And I would love for research as a whole to appreciate that more. Nobody is denying that AI will change most of what we do today. But I think the discipline in itself grew because we really figured out ways to understand humans and how they live their lives, how they want to progress. And, there is a certain danger that we lose that key value of research, but keen to hear what the experts actually say.
So as we go around this process of learning some of the oddities, the extreme behaviors that Sandro is able to pick up from the detailed social listening and intelligence, the immersion with them, the spending time with these individuals helps us to uncover a deeper understanding. The difference is like between reading about someone and spending time with someone. You get a deeper appreciation of who they are, what their motivations are, why are they doing what they're doing, why are they developing these particular hacks. What this helps us to do is the need behind the hack. And is that need stable? Is it just trendy for now, or is it a long-term trend? And once you start to realize if there is a sense of stability behind that need, you can then start to look at further solutions that address that particular need. There's a interesting experiment that we were doing to try to understand what's happening in the realm of functional coffees. or coffees in general, we realize that whilst there are multiple functional teas, there aren't too many functional coffees. And even in the context of functional coffees, there's some innovations, that user-led innovations that are happening in the context of mushroom coffees. So why are these individuals looking at mushroom coffees or microdosing, and what does this mean? And the need behind it, is that stable? And perhaps it is just a reflection of the times that we live in, the stresses that we go through. The answer may not necessarily be in mushroom coffee or CBD infused coffee, but perhaps in multiple such in multiple such solutions that are coming from a very fertile ground for innovation.
Absolutely.
That's what the combination of the two helps us to do. But there's a third aspect. The third aspect is, now that we've identified these behaviors, we've understood these behaviors, we want to make sure that we can translate them into something that the larger mass in the middle can adopt. And there is a need then to reframe those behaviors, to understand from the masses, why aren't they adopting mushroom coffee or CBD infused coffee, etc., etc. I'm sure the need exists there as well, but what's stopping them from doing that? And once we can start to figure out what that reframe is, you could then have a product that could move beyond the fringes and to the masses in the middle.
And that kind of is what I was kind of asking next, which is kind of the indicators and the things that when you look at something or a product, is there like an indicator or like a point or something, whatever you want to call it, that's when you look into an edge behavior that you feel like, okay, this is going to move towards the mainstream, move towards like the common everyone audience? Is there something like that?
Yeah. There are a couple of. Some of them are more like on the metric side. So obviously, when you discover a hack, you would then try to ladder it up to a group of solutions that people develop for themselves to solve a problem. So we call them need solution pairs, right? So there are solutions, and one person who develops it like that, another person completely different, but they're all targeting to solve the same problem, right? And once you have that, you can then obviously look at, is that diffusing in the community? You look at the velocity, the relative size of things. But probably the most important thing, and it alludes to what Ajay was just describing, we're looking at the fringes, right? And we are looking at people who innovate ahead of the market, because that's essentially what they're doing, right? So they are not willing to wait until the market is catching up on their need that they experience right now, because they are ahead of the curve. So they start doing something themselves, right? That's how Netflix started, with retasting, developing something for movie rental or renting entertainment systems and so forth. Once you have identified that, what you obviously have to do is to look stronger into the need, right? You look at a solution that a user at the fringe develop, but is that need, is the problem that this person trying to solve actually growing at the edge that we are looking at, but also the mass market, right? And looking at those trajectories are very, very strong indications to understand, is there a chance for mass adoption? At what point in time it will likely enter into the mass market? So essentially, we're trying to help our clients to be truly ahead of time when it comes to the discovery of solutions that could inspire whatever they are building, but most importantly, needs that are emerging before they become broadly visible to them.
And I want to add to that, Sandro, because that was one of the things that I loved about the work you had done, is that you could give us some of these early indications as to what things are trendy versus really trending. And the process that we developed sort of includes now things like trends that are happening or things that are growing. I think at one time, to think this way was right. Like, you find these little edge behaviors. Is this going to be something that's ever big? And if you look at some of the things that have been successful, it's take a long time for it to actually, become something big. Whereas today, you can eliminate or at least mitigate a lot of that risk, right? Today, you can look at some of the velocities that he's talking about, or which of these lead users are doing the things that tie more directly to more mainstream behaviors. So there's a lot of data that we can analyze that
Yeah.
point us in the right direction.
Yeah.
A workshopping standpoint. So if we bring it all together, and I would simplify how we look at it to saying, A, is there a real insight behind it? So if Sandra's given us this nugget of an idea, and then April's team has helped us to deeply immerse in it and really understand the whys behind it, then we can say, okay, is this a real insight, or is this just something kind of kooky that people have been playing around with and it was kind of fun? If it's just kind of fun, that might be trendy, but not a long-term trend. But if there's a real insight behind it, so, for example, going back to like that washing their hair with conditioner thing, we found out that it really was very relevant to people who had certain hair types. And by the way, those hair types were growing in the world. And so there's a lot of reason to believe that that could continue to accelerate. And then there were some other trends that were happening that also made that behavior sort of relevant. It fit with the trend. So we kind of look in our workshopping at what are some accelerators and what are some so, we know from behavioral science that if there's a big barrier to something, it's going to be less likely to expand. So again, if I go back to that washing your hair with conditioner, there's not a big barrier to that, right? It's a lot of people have conditioner. It's not expensive versus some of these things, like if you have to find an ingredient in the woods, that's a big barrier. So we could look at things in, that kind of analytical framework and very simply, and then say, okay, do we think this has legs?
That's very interesting. I never thought about it, but it makes total sense. And you have to be analytic about it. Like sometimes you just cannot get the ingredient in the woods. We could talk about this for hours. I have one more question about steps or practical things or advices. Is there an advice or a practical step that people that are listening, or anyone from like organizations, some CEOs, like middlemen, that can start using or start applying this framework, this approach to what they do on their day-to-day work?
Yeah, I can kind of start us off with a couple of just easy ideas. One is understand sort of how people are using your product off-label in ways that it's not intended to be used. And or what are people doing to mimic your product, or what it's not doing in the category? What are some of those hacks that they're doing? And when you find them, don't dismiss them, dig into them. So that'd be sort of the first thing. And then the second thing is I think a lot of times we see these ideas and we think, okay, we need to invent a new product for that. And there are a lot of barriers to inventing a new product. But sometimes you don't have to invent a new product. You could just bring that thinking into how you communicate about your brand today, if it makes sense with your brand. So if we go back to that ASMR cleaning example, maybe you're not going to come out with a product that has a different sensory experience, but maybe you would have a demo in your social media advertising that would give some of that feel of ASMR. So if that was a real trend in your category, you could sort of play off it in a small way with a small investment and dip your toe in it.
Yeah, that helps with the risk too, right, Karen? I mean, you don't have to invest in a lot of capital behind some new innovative product. Maybe it's just in how you communicate or in a promotional idea or something that starts to get you, centered as the expert in this new emerging thing before you have to invest a whole lot of money to actually, do something big with it.
Are there any categories or industries that you feel like this approach would work better than others?
It's a great question. Yeah. Sandra, you probably have a big span across. I can start us off just by saying, having worked in a number of different categories, you'd be surprised. Like, a lot of people think that cleaning is a boring category. It's actually fascinating, the things that people do to clean.
Yeah, I think everything in the context of B2B will be probably a little hard for us, because due to confidentiality, people don't share much, right? But everything that has consumer context, and actually, funny enough, the first pilot that we wanted to do together and really experiencing what we are bringing together, how our two approaches supplement each other, we deliberately picked the hardest possible category in our minds, which is cleaning, because most people would look at it as not very involving to most consumers, right? And then it was actually mind-blowing how much edge behaviors such as ASMR cleaning, but also very minimalistic ways of cleaning it, like super aesthetic things and so on, And we then started to discover that cleaning in our today's world is something like an unwinding activity, right? So I have crazy days. I'm incredibly busy, probably too many devices to pay attention to. And then in the evening, I clean my house with a horsehair brush very slowly, deliberately, right? That gives a benefit to people. Um, I wouldn't be able to tell any limitation. I mean, the biggest successes we clearly had were in categories that obviously bring a lot of high involvement with them, right? Think pet care, think gamers or coders that exist in communities, in digital environments, right? Where they share the academic work. In the very early days when we started to work with the MIT and develop and then publish a methodology, were on kite surfing, because kite surfing is a very interesting sports discipline because it was actually invented by users. So literally windsurfers and skateboarders and wakeboarders coming together to invent a new sports discipline. And then over the first 10 years, there was no equipment dedicated to the sport. So it was a lot of exchanging materials and so on to invent a new sports discipline. So it was only hacking for 10 years and then the first manufacturer come in. So it's a great area to explore. Yeah, we even did it on farming and crop management, things like that, where there's also a lot of innovation because there are a lot of regulation on, I don't know, pesticide application precision and so on. There are also farmers who get creative and figure their way out. You know, humans will always do that. So I wouldn't see a natural limitation in terms of categories where we can't explore it.
That's great. Well, the research world, the next big thing, exploring the edge for high growth opportunities, it will be linked on the description of this episode for anyone that wants to read it. Is there anywhere else where people can learn more about the edge framework and this project?
We have a few papers that are on our corporate website as well. They talk about fortune at the fringes and the next best thing with edge. You could also write to each of us, and we'll be happy to share more information.
There you go. Well, April, Sandro, Karin, AJ, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your explanation of the project, of the framework. Yeah, I hope anyone's listening learn something new, can use this in their day-to-day, and yeah, contact the authors and the project owners. And yeah, thank you so much again for your time.
Thank
Thank
you,
you so
and
much for having us.
And that's all for today, folks. Talking Insights is a production of Research World and SMR, bringing you the stories, voices, and ideas shaping the insights community around the world. If you'd like to be featured in a future episode, share your story, or learn more about sponsoring opportunities, send us an email at podcast@smr.org. And don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And join us next week for another great conversation. See ya.